Welcome to the HiRSE Seminar Series on Research Software Engineering in Helmholtz and beyond.
Well, thanks, Claire, for this introduction and for inviting me back. Indeed, this is a slightly updated version of a talk I've given at, I think it was the 11th HiRSE seminar about a year ago. And I'm really glad that this has been fairly well attended, I believe, and also that there's quite a few people here today, because I really believe that the topic of software citation touches a central point that sets research software engineering apart from basically all other forms of software engineering practice. I'll start off with saying a few words about who or what I am, really, and what my story is, why I'm giving this talk today. So I have a background in the humanities, got an MA in English, Modern German Literature and Linguistics, and then I've worked as an RSE before the name existed in linguistics for about 10 years. During this role, or having this role, I have become interested in the issues that software development and research brings with it, specifically with regard to the sustainability of the work we do. And I've become a fellow of the SSI, as Claire has mentioned, in 2018. I've just shortly after that, I've switched fields basically to try and do more work in the direction of software sustainability, and software citation is a big part of it. And I've been a doctoral researcher, but also an RSE in computer science at the German Aerospace Center for a number of years now. And this is probably relevant for the talk as well, I'm a project lead founder of the citation file format, which will feature quite a bit in this talk, and all the other things Claire has mentioned, apart from that. I've also run a project with colleagues from other Helmholtz centers called HiRSE, which deals with software publication, which I'm also going to touch upon later on in the talk. So what am I going to do? I'm going to start off, after introducing myself, to ask you a few questions. And I'd like you to now open a browser. If you haven't, go to slido.com and enter the code that's on this slide. And this is also on the actual Slido page. And I'd like to ask you two questions that deal with software citation. The first one is just about your experience with software citation in the past. Let me know if you have any issues accessing the Slido, and I can try and help. But take a minute now and go through the answers, try and see what your experience is with software citation. And I'll have a little look at the numbers. Around about 35 people here today. And this starts to look like a mixed bill. And I'm really, really happy to see that. As for now, at the top of this poll is the answer that yes, as a researcher, I cite the software that I use in my research. And I'm also happy that a lot of people have said that you sort of know what software citation is, you know that you should do it, but you don't do it yet, because this is really, the talk is really for you. And hopefully at the end of this talk, you'll know a little more about software citation and how you can actually apply it in your daily work. Thanks very much. I'll now pop over to the next poll, which is related. And that's just for me to know what your actual practice of software citation is at the moment as an RSE. So if you create software, how do you make it citable if you do? Again, I'll give it a couple of minutes to get some answers here. Just give a couple minutes, a couple of seconds more to see the numbers go up. Okay, and so with around about 2/3 of people having answered this, it's interesting to see that this actually reflects, the results actually reflect what we currently think about when we talk about software citation. And it's also, I guess, due to the pressure we feel in, again, working in research, having to write papers that writing papers that describe the software itself is one of the two top answers. And the other one is sort of an informal citation practice that where people put in text somewhere in their repository, somewhere in the documentation or in a text file, or even in the UI that's shipped with the software. If you like, you can continue answering the polls, but I'm going to stop sharing these now and switch back to my slides. And so let me start off by the actual talk by saying why I think RSEs really should know about software citation. Why should you want to know about this topic in the first place? The short answer is the R in RSE, I think, is really important. We contribute to research with the software we produce, and this means that we contribute to human knowledge, no less. This also means that some of the basic principles of research in general also apply to the research software that we develop. And I think specifically, this means that researchers have an obligation to disclose how they reach their results and conclusions. I mean, this is true for all of research. So when we write a paper, we have to disclose the parts that we have used to reach a conclusion or to get results, produce results. Part of this is that that we all provide information about the software that we have used in our research. And this information, of course, enables others to understand how the research was produced, how it was the results were produced, how the research was conducted. It builds confidence in the results that we present in papers and in the conclusions we draw from these results. And disclosing this information of all the parts we've used is crucial for reproducibility. By the same token, we should also, as RSEs, be accountable for our software work. And this means, of course, that we're responsible for creating the software, the research software that we produce, to the level of quality that is appropriate for the use case we target with the software. And that includes that we make sure that it's correct under a given definition of correctness for that special use case. But it also means that we should take credit for our work. So I think taking credit is an important part of being accountable for the research software work that we do. And so the primary and the established method to provide information about the research process, the previous work that we've used or reused in our research or in our research software engineering work, is, and also the primary method to give credit to the creators of previous work, is to formally cite that work. It's fairly obvious, you've all done it in the past. The point is that if research software is formally cited, this makes it findable, and by extension also potentially at least accessible and reusable. And this is in accordance again with the FAIR for research software principles, which you've heard about, which is an adaptation of the FAIR principles of sharing research data. And so all we need now is to find out what formally citing research software actually means. And thankfully, colleagues from the Force 11 Software Citation Working Group have written a paper about it called the Software Citation Principles, and it lists 6 principles of software citation that you should keep in the back of your head when listening to me giving this talk. And the very first one is importance is a principle of software citation. And this means that software should be cited in, like papers are cited, like other research output is cited in practice. Software citation should enable credit and attribution for the software authors and or contributors. And I'll talk a bit about that later on. Software citation should provide unique identification of a piece of software that has been used in a given research project that is presented in a paper, for example. It should point to a persisted version of that actual software, to the artifacts. Could be ideally the source code, but it could also be a downloadable binary or something like that. It should allow for accessibility to the software, so there should be an actual kind of URL or a link that takes you to a place where you can access the software and access the metadata about the software to better understand what the software is about in the first place. And this is really important, the citation of a software should be specific. So it should identify the version that's actually been used in research. Ideally, this would be a released version of a software, but it could also be a single commit from a version control history. Now, why don't we already do this? That's because software as such isn't easily citable. It's really hard to find out the different parts that you need to cite a software formally, like you would cite a paper, from just having the software and running the software. And that's because papers usually have something like a front page that includes all the relevant information, authors, the title of the paper. Papers hardly ever have many versions, so the version isn't really that relevant. It could be the publication date. Who's the publisher? What is the publication date of that paper? We don't have that for software. And I think that's easily understandable if you look at kind of software UIs, command line interfaces, notebooks, or even repositories. So what we as RSE have to do to make it possible for others to cite the software the way it should be cited formally is to provide that kind of front page for our software, so to speak. So how do we actually do that? One of the main things to know is that this really is at the core of RSE work, because only you or your project people know the correct citation metadata for the software, and thus it's up to you to provide and maintain up-to-date metadata for the software you produce. So, for example, you have to tell people what name they should use for your software if they cite it. You will know who the authors are to enable credit and attribution in software citation. And this can be a range of things. It can mean everyone who's ever contributed something to a source code repository. It could mean people that haven't actually committed anything to GitHub or GitLab or whatever you use, but have done other work outside of actually implementing software. It could be UI designers, etc., testers, manual testers, people that have informed the software project. And so the notion of software author isn't really clearly defined. It's ongoing work. I actually am part of a task force at the Research Software Alliance that looks into defining a better definition of software authorship, and also looking at contribution roles and what roles feature and how they can be represented in metadata. Other things that you should need to tell people is what the current version of the software is. I mean, sometimes that can be found out by just looking at the commit history of a repository, if people use software straight out of a repository. But be specific. So actually use some sort of versioning scheme to provide versions of the software. Tell people what versions they should use. So should they only use released versions? Can they use anything? Because if they don't know, they will just do whatever they see fit. And that's sometimes difficult, especially in combination with providing the correct metadata. And let people know where they can find the source code to enable accessibility of your software. And so providing citation metadata for your software is one thing. People will know how to cite it. But the other thing also is to make it even easier is publish your software, and do not only publish it once, publish it in kind of regularly, depending on what your development the plan is. So if you will have several different versions of the same software, publish every single version and provide the correct metadata for that version. If it's, say, a script that you use once to produce results for a paper, make sure that you still publish that version that's been used in the paper. So how can we provide the metadata that people will have to use, or that we want people to use to cite your software correctly? There is a format, like I mentioned this very early on. It's called the citation file format, and it's been created to allow you to do exactly that. It's a relatively simple YAML format. So you have key value pairs, and the values can be either strings or arrays or integers. But this format allows you to define the metadata that people should use to cite your software. And you can write that into a file, should be called citation capitals.cff. You can put that file in the source code repository. And whenever you prepare a new release of your software, or whenever you think now is a good time to update, or now is the time to update that file, that information, for example, if the authors list is changed, update the file as you would update your source code files. It is a version format, so the current version is 1.2.0. We're currently working on the next version that will include even better stuff. It gives you the opportunity to provide all the central information that you would need to make it possible for other people to formally cite your software in the paper. And because we should also disclose our own previous work. So if you write a paper, you put up a list of references of the works that you've used to write that paper, the work that you build on. By extension, we should disclose the previous work that we have used to build our software. And this will usually include software dependencies mainly, but it may also include, for example, a paper that describes an algorithm that your software implements. So in principle, what you want to do is you want to build a list of references for your software like you would create a list of references for your paper. And CFF, the citation file format, can do that. You can have a list of references with several different types of reference, including softwares. You can actually update your list automatically, if you like, from a manifest file with the dependencies of your software. What it can also do, but I wouldn't really encourage you to do that, is you can, if you feel the pressure of having to write papers about the software and you really need these papers to be cited to keep your job or get a new job or get a promotion or something like that, you can also define a preferred citation, which could be a paper. And in some circumstances, people will understand that this is the citation you will have to use, but also encourage people to always cite the software because that's the actual product of your work. There is experimental dataset support. Is just a type you can add to the file if you want to make a dataset citable, but that's not really something that we will actively support in the future. So it will stay experimental for the time being. Why would you want to use the citation file format over any of the other metadata formats that are out there? Most prominently Code Meta, which is a JSON linked data implemented format for describing software more generally. It's because, well, one of the things we think why this is valuable is because we have a lot of tooling around CFF that's been built by the project itself, by external contributor in many different languages. So you can see if you can find a tool that fits your development ecosystem. Tools to create the CFF files, tools to edit and update them. You can validate CFF files. You can convert them into other metadata formats, BibTeX, JSON, etc. Code Meta as well, of course. The one single tool to get you started is depicted here on the left-hand side, which is a form-based web application created at the Netherlands East Side Center. It's called CFF Init, and this is really good for getting you started with just creating your first CFF file. So feel free to, after this talk, click the link. I guess the slides are going to be shared, and they're also on Zenodo already if you want to have a look, and create your first CFF file for your project if you haven't got one. There is an overview on the CFF website as well about all the tools we know of at the moment. The other interesting thing is that GitHub, about 2.5 years ago, started to support the format, or started to use the format for providing citation information for the repositories they host. And the way this works is that if you have a citation.cff file in your repository, the GitHub platform will detect it and then convert and render the citation metadata on the front page of your repository. And this will also be updated at whatever version, whatever branch, whatever tag people look at in your repository. So the version of the CFF file that's in the actual view on the repository will be rendered and displayed there, both as a BibTeX string, so people can easily copy and paste that into their LaTeX documents, and as an APA string for easy copy and pasting. And there's some documentation around how they support that as well. The other great thing, and this kind of sort of is a pointer to software publication later on, in this talk is that Zenodo, as one of the most prominent open access repositories, archival repositories where you can put stuff and give it a DOI and have it archived for a longer period of time than is guaranteed on GitHub. Zenodo supports CFF as an input format for metadata. So this here is quite an old example where you have a Zenodo. So Zenodo have a bridge to GitHub, an integration where they listen to new releases on GitHub repositories, and once a new release is done, they will pull not only the artifacts from the repository, zip them up, and create a record in Zenodo. They also would take the metadata, or try and take the metadata from the repository itself and display that as the metadata of the Zenodo record. And in the past, this has been using the GitHub API. It still does, unless you have a citation.cff file in your repository, and then Zenodo will ingest that file and use it to display the information you provide rather than the information that's been guessed from the GitHub API. So this is really useful to kind of streamline your publication workflow. So if you have this Zenodo GitHub bridge activated on Zenodo and you create a new release and you have a CFF file with the updated information for that new release, then Zenodo will pull it in and display it in the record. There is some support from other tools as well. For example, reference managers. So you can, if you have this, if you have Zotero installed and you have this browser plugin installed, you can click on the button, on the Zotero button on any GitHub repository, and they will pull in the information from the CFF file rather than from the GitHub API, for example, or from information displayed on the page itself. And you can also import CFF files in Jabrev, to name just the probably two of the more prominent examples of open source reference management. Starting with version 1.2.0, we have started to provide a JSON schema for CFF, which has made it much easier for us to develop and test the format. But also, because we've published the JSON schema to schemastore.org, we now have kind of inbuilt out of the box auto-completion and validation in a couple of IDEs if you've connected to schemastore.org. So this is an example from PyCharm, I think, where you can see that you have auto-completion. You can kind of pre-fill a simple version of the CFF file, and that gets you started with kind of not only building the file, but also make sure that you have correct values for all the fields that are in the file. And the last bit is a lot of people already use citation CFF files to provide citation information. At the time now, we have around 15,000 files in 15,000 different repositories. On GitHub, there are a number of larger names in that list as well. We don't really know for sure because the GitHub search API that we use to try and collect this information is not always the most reliable. So, in conclusion of that part, if you want to get started with the citation file format, create a file, use the web application, the form-based web application to create the initial file. You can refine it using IDE support, of course. Look at the documentation if you want to do more complex stuff. And this is really useful because apparently it helps you create valid CFF files. If you can write them by hand, they're easy enough to understand. But if you use CFF in it, we've seen in some of the data we've collected in the past that this really helped people with the validity of their CFF files. Right. So the other thing I wanted to talk about, and this is the second point of a good practice of software citation or enabling software citation for your software, is you should publish your software. And publishing software is not something that's really common at the moment. A lot of people still write papers about the software they produce, and this is all good and well. It gives you, brownie points with the higher ups. Maybe if you're lucky, maybe you're cited. Maybe the papers are cited well enough that you can actually build a career on such a paper. But publishing software as a paper is not really a thing, because you publish a piece of text and not the software itself. And The same is true to a lesser extent if you publish software in a software journal, which is a great bridge technology between writing papers about the software and actually publishing the software itself. You may have heard about software journals such as the Journal of Open Source Software, abbreviated JOSS, where you can write a very brief, 2 pages of text, a description of the software, but also submit the open source code repository link to the journal. And what's actually been reviewed is the text to some extent, but mainly also the contents of the repository. So people will review your code, will see if all the good practice in software development has been implemented in your project, having tests, having documentation, having a clear path to downloading, installing the software and reusing it, etc. One issue I still see with software journals is that they provide only one point in time for your software. So usually if you have quite an agile development style or development process, you would release a fair number of releases of your software every now and then. You probably don't, or you probably can't even submit all of these versions to a software journal. And so maybe you can do that with new major releases, but it's not really giving people who maybe have used a minor or a patch release of your software the opportunity to cite the actual version of your software. So what instead you should do, you should publish the software to a repository whenever you think it's release ready and you want to give people access to a new version. Why you should do it on a more abstract level is to, and this is the main point, of course, here, is to enable software citation, because publishing your software will give people all the metadata that they need to cite your software correctly and cite the exact version, have a DOI, et cetera, but also to make the software fair, which is something that's increasingly being asked for, to have fair open access publications of software. And also to let software actually count towards the evaluation of your work, if that's something that your institution does. The Helmholtz organization of research institutions in Germany has recently introduced a key performance indicator in that they have started to look at the number of citable software publications that centers are outputting in 2023, and then they will also introduce, or are plans to introduce, a quality indicator that's kind of building a more complex indicator for them to see how the institutions are performing in terms of software in the future. And so perhaps this is something that will be relevant to you in the future. So there are good reasons for publishing your software. How do you actually do that? At the time being, like I said, you publish the software if you can, if maybe you have closed source software that you can't share with the general public, and then you can at least publish the citation metadata to a publication repository, such as Zenodo, such as your institutional repository of whatever implementation they use. Like I said, the repository publication will give you the option to publish each and every single version of the software. And in this respect, repository publications are more worthwhile than having software journal publications. Although culturally, probably at the moment at least, so a software journal publication will perhaps give you more credit for the time being. Important to note that here's a bad word from the countries, having your source code repository public, that's not a publication. Even if you push regularly to your GitHub or GitLab repository, this is not really a publication, because these things can go away at any time. You can force push commits to overwrite stuff. You can change the history. So this is not something that's reliable enough to be used for a citable publication. In practice, what I would suggest is that you publish, like I said, every release you think is ready for the public on Zenodo or on your institutional repository. And this will then give you a DOI which satisfies the unique identification software citation principle. It will give you some persistence in the form of an archived snapshot of the actual software artifacts. It will give you an identifier that will allow people to actually access the artifacts as a software, and this satisfies the accessibility criterion of the software citation principles. And finally, an identifier that points to a specific version. And this is important if people really want to disclose all the actual parts they've used in the research. It can be quite tedious to do this for each and every single version, especially if you release many versions of the software. So in the past, the way was to fill in a form, sometimes a pre-filled form from a previous version on a repository manually. I've already mentioned that you can, at least with the specific combination of platforms you use, you can automate this a bit by using CFF files on GitHub and publishing them to Zenodo. If that's not something you can do, there is a project called HiRSE, which is just officially ended. We're, of course, still working on it, which has dealt with automating this process, making it easier for you to publish software with complete and rich metadata in an automated fashion. And so the way that what the project provides is basically CI pipelines and continuous integration pipelines. If you use them already, for example, to run automated tests in your repository, then great. If not, it's fairly easy to set up on the main repository platforms, GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, etc. And the way the CI workflows work is whenever you push a new version to your source code repository, this will then trigger a continuous integration job that will execute a Python package that we develop and publish. And this Python package will do a number of things to make sure that the metadata you provide with your software in that publication is up to scratch. It looks at existing metadata files, CFF, code meta, etc. It also will look at code files, so comments, etc. It looks at documentation, and it also picks up information from platform APIs such as the GitHub API or the GitLab API, but also perhaps static code analysis platforms in the future. It collates all that metadata. It tries to make a coherent set of metadata for that specific version you want to publish, and it then presents that coherent set of metadata to you as the developer who wants to publish the software to check and to make sure that it's the version of the metadata you want to publish, and then you can automate the publication process from that. So whenever, in practice, this means whenever you have a pull request with the metadata, you can, or a merge request, you can commit that, you can merge that into the branch, and then the second part of the CI pipeline of the HiRSE workflow will run and publish the metadata and the artifacts if you want to attach some to you to the publication repository you've configured. It sounds and perhaps looks more complex than it actually is. So what you actually do in your project is you set up a CI pipeline workflow file, and then the rest is automated. I've just seen a comment here that Andre, you've tried HiRSE last December with GitLab, you couldn't get it running. We're still in the process of producing the final output of the project. So if you bear with us just a couple of hopefully weeks, perhaps months at the most longer, we will have something ready that will target GitLab just as well, because GitLab is one of the most prominent platforms used in German research institutions, at least. So it's definitely one of the things we will support. The good thing about this is that it also helps you to publish your closed source software. If you can't publish your software under an open source license, if you can make it accessible to the general public, then you can still use HiRSE to publish the metadata, and that in itself will give people the opportunity to cite your software with the correct metadata. Right, this is just some more information about the project. So we're a Helmholtz metadata collaboration project, or we have been across 3 different Helmholtz centers: German Aerospace Center, Forschungszentrum Jülich, and Helmholtz-Zentrum Dresden-Rossendorf. And if you're planning to go to the RSE 24, which is coming up fairly soon, our colleague Sophie will run a workshop there that will get you started with the HiRSE workflow. So Andre, if you attend DRSE 24, I suggest you attend that workshop as well. And then members of the team will be there to help you set up your process and hopefully won't have any more issues. And that's pretty much it. So as conclusion, I will suggest that enabling software citation is really a core part of your job as a research software engineer. Get yourself acquainted with it. Make sure that you understand the basics and make the most use of the technology that's there. So a very good starting point is creating a citation.cff file with the correct citation metadata that only you or your project will know. Make sure you maintain that in the source code repository for your software and update it whenever necessary. Also, as the next step, look into publishing every release you want to make accessible to the public to a source to an archive repository. Could be Zenodo, could be something else. And finally, because as RSEs, we're usually not only software engineers but also researchers to some extent. Make sure that you cite the software that you use as you would cite a paper if you write papers. If not, tell your colleagues about this and ask them to cite software that they use formally with all the relevant metadata. That's it. Thanks very much. Thanks for listening. And I will now have a look at the Zoom chat to see if there are any open questions.
Thank you for watching our seminar. Please check out the slides on Zenodo linked below and see you next time.